This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Most of us will experience trauma at some point in our life and will have some kind of psychological reaction to that. It might be fear or sadness, guilt. But there are a smaller subset of people who go on to have more severe, long-standing problems. And those people might be diagnosed with what's known as post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is immensely, or can be immensely, debilitating and disruptive of people's lives. It affects 1 in 20 people, and in this lecture tonight you are going to hear from the expert, I guess we'd like to say, the national expert but also the international leader in PTSD, Professor Richard Bryant. He's going to review what we know about PTSD, how it develops, its course, best available treatments, and there will be some time at the end for you to ask some questions. Now, just a little bit about Richard. He is the Director of the Traumatic Stress Clinic and Scientia Professor of Psychology at the University of New South Wales. His research has focused on identifying people at risk of mental health problems after trauma, early intervention strategies for those people, treatment per se for PTSD, and also complicated grief. He's had a remarkable effect on the scientific research endeavour in this area, looking at genetic, neural and psychological factors underpinning PTSD. So he's got all levels covered. And his assessment and treatment protocols, that is the translation of his research into the real-world clinic, has been translated in over 15 languages and used in many, many countries. And just to give you an extent of the prolific nature of his work, he has 570 scientific publications, which is just a phenomenal number. Hopefully he'll tell us how he does this as part of the talk, as well as 5 books and 70 book chapters. He's worked on many major national and international projects, securing large amounts of funding from NH and MRC, PTSD treatment, guideline projects. He's developed web treatments for US troops returning from Iraq, assisted tsunami survivors in Thailand, developed counselling programs for disaster survivors in the USA after Hurricane Katrina, and then web-based treatments for complicated grief patients in the USA. He's also served on major committees that define PTSD internationally, and in recognition of this just enormous and remarkable achievement, in 2016 he received the Companion of the Order of Australia for services to research and management of traumatic stress. So I hope you feel privileged. We truly are. You're in for a special treat. Please join me in welcoming Richard.
Hello everybody, and thank you for that very kind introduction. You put enormous pressure on me, and now I have to deliver. It's a great pleasure and an honour to give the Alice Barber lecture. It has an incredible tradition, so it's great to be somebody who's been asked to do it, and of course it's always a great pleasure to be invited to sunny Melbourne. And I do congratulate you all on managing to get out here in this abysmal weather. It'll probably be worse when you walk out of here. Now, one of the challenges of giving a lecture like this is that I think we've probably got a sample of academics in the room, we've probably got some clinicians, and probably people from the public who are just interested in the topic. So I need to pitch this talk at the right level, and so what I've decided to do is try to cover a range of topics in a way that there might be something in it for everybody. So bear with me if some of it doesn't seem totally relevant to you. But what I wanted to do is ask the questions, what is post-traumatic stress disorder? Just give you a brief overview. What causes it? What is the course of it? How does it travel over time? And I guess most importantly, how do we treat it? How do we manage it? Now, in terms of PTSD and stress reactions, people have been talking about it for literally thousands of years. But it's really become very popular in the last century. It was really in the First World War in the trenches that people started to really talk about the psychological effects of overwhelming trauma. And people had all sorts of discussions, and people focused on the stupor and the dazed experience that people had in the face of trauma. You can just see the look in these people's eyes when they're just staring at the camera. But these were very loose descriptions that people had, and it was only sort of years and years later with Vietnam, when so many troops coming back from Vietnam, that psychiatry really needed to come to terms with this thing, and that's when PTSD was for the first time created as a diagnosis in 1980. And it's gone through a number of different iterations over the years, and the main sort of psychiatric Bible that we follow in Australia is something called DSM. It's run by the American Psychiatric Association, and it defines PTSD in the following way. You must be exposed to a significant threat, or you've got to witness it. Now, it's not something mild, it's not a stressor, it's not a bit of bullying or something, but the statistics tell us that it's more likely to develop when you've been exposed to something really life-threatening and very serious. But once you've been through that, you need to have a bunch of symptoms. And the hallmark symptom is what we call re-experiencing. And these are memories of the trauma that just keep occurring over and over again. I don't mean to think about them, they keep popping into my head, they're very distressing, they're very disturbing, and it's more like I'm reliving the experience. So there's a very strong perceptual element to it. So you talk to somebody who's been through a very, very bad car accident. They won't just tell you that the car just hit the telegraph pole. They'll tell you at that moment they can actually feel the body as if it's sliding. They can actually feel the sensation of their head going through the windscreen. They can perhaps smell petrol or perhaps taste blood in their mouth. It's that real, and it causes great distress. That leads to the next cluster of symptoms, which is avoidance. The distress is so strong, I don't want to have it, so I do whatever I can to avoid that distress. And so anything that reminds me of it, I'm going to avoid those things. And in DSM, we had a new sort of set of symptoms brought in, which was just a collection of things where there's distorted thoughts, beliefs and moods about the whole experience. So people often catastrophise how badly it hurt them, or how likely it is they're going to get hurt again, or how responsible they were for it. And also it affects people's moods in a range of ways. It can not just be fear, but it can be anger, guilt, shame, etc. And then the final major cluster is arousal. And that is, people typically are just very, very anxious all of the time, and this is manifest in a whole bunch of symptoms like sleep disturbance, they're very jumpy, they're very hypervigilant to threats around them, that sort of thing. Now, the basic facts about PTSD. Most of us, and most people in this room, will be exposed to a traumatic event at some time in your life. And we know this in most relatively secure countries, in Western countries. Most people will still be exposed to something traumatic. But PTSD will actually affect a minority of us. At any one time, probably 2 to 3% of the population have PTSD, and overall across countries, probably about 12 to 15% have had PTSD at some time in their lives. Interestingly, it doesn't affect everybody the same. Women are twice as likely to develop PTSD as men. And this is not simply due to the sort of events they might be exposed to, such as sexual assault, etc. And there's a whole many biological reasons as to why this might be the case. But I think the take-home message that you need to take from this particular PowerPoint is that most people are resilient. So most of us are exposed to trauma. Most of us will have initial distress and fear after a traumatic event, but most of us adapt. Now, what causes PTSD? Now, I'm going to rush you through this. It's a little heavy, but I'm going to try to sort of give you a Psych 101 sort of abbreviated course in what causes PTSD. And it's based on traditional classical conditioning theory. This is the main model that we follow. Not the only one, but the main one. Now, in psychology, if we put a rat in a chamber and we give it an electric shock and we put a light on in that chamber at the same time, that rat learns something very powerful. It learns that that light is no longer just a benign light, it's actually signalling threat. And what that means is when we put that rat in that chamber and we turn the light on again, but we don't shock it this time, we're just turning the light on, it's waiting for it to get shocked. And what we see is that it actually has a whole range of fear reactions, just like we do when we go through a fearful event. Now, the trauma field has jumped onto this model with gusto, and it's been very useful for us. Because essentially the trauma is like the electric shock. And the fear that the rat has is like, the rat's fright is like the fear that a human has. So for example, if a woman is raped, when she's actually dealing with somebody who's actually got a knife at her throat, the fear that she has is like the electric shock hitting the rat. And all the things around at the time of that traumatic assault, they are like the electric light. So subsequently, when that woman gets exposed to those reminders just aren't benign reminders anymore, they're signals of threat. So it may be that the next time that woman is smelling aftershave, or maybe BO, or maybe she just is around men. These are all reminders that were associated with the fear at the time of the trauma, and then they trigger a lot of traumatic memories and distress, just like the rat does in response to the light. But an important aspect of this model, though, is that what we know from an incredible number of animal and human studies is that if we keep putting that rat back in the chamber and we keep turning the light on, but we're not shocking it anymore, the rat does engage in new learning. It's called extinction learning. And essentially it's learning now that that light is now no longer signalling threat, it's now signalling safety. And it's overriding that initial learning that happened. And in a sense, that's what we think most of us go through when we go through trauma. Initially we have a bit of fear conditioning, but then subsequently we undergo extinction learning. So for example, the rape victim may meet men who don't hurt her. She may go out at night and experience darkness, but nothing bad happens. She may even have sex and it's not an aversive outcome. Each one of those things is an extinction trial that teaches her, I'm safe. And then, if you like, the fear conditioning becomes weaker and weaker. Now, what we know overall in PTSD is that, in general, there tends to be this course over time of having a PTSD reaction in the first days after the event, and then the rate of PTSD will typically subside over time. Now, essentially what's happening, and that down the bottom there we've got weeks. Essentially what's happening over those weeks is extinction learning is happening. So each week I'm getting exposed to different reminders, things aren't happening to me that are bad, and so I'm learning I'm safe again. But that doesn't happen for everybody. There's about this proportion of people that develop PTSD, and they, in a sense, have failed extinction learning. Now, this model with the rats has been really good because rats are not like humans. We can do a lot of invasive work, and so we've learnt a lot about the neurobiology of fear now and trauma. I'm just going to keep this simple, but it is worth knowing. And in essence, the learning that goes on at the time of trauma, where my fear is associated with all the things that are going on at the time of the traumatic event, basically happen in a part of the brain called the basolateral nucleus of the amygdala. It's a very small part in a primitive part of the brain. And that is where we actually experience and project a lot of our fear. Now, the main model of PTSD, putting it really simply, is this. The amygdala is hyperreactive. And what we know with most people who engage in extinction learning, there's a bit of the brain up the top here, around the medial prefrontal cortex. It downregulates the amygdala. And when that's doing its job, you can enjoy extinction learning. But basically the model is, in PTSD, that ain't working so well. And the one robust finding we have from fMRI studies is that people with PTSD have impoverished medial prefrontal cortex recruitment. And the notion is that these people are really not recruiting that important part of the brain that they need recruiting in order to be able to regulate the amygdala and to be able to engage in extinction learning. So, let me talk a little bit about the course of PTSD. Now, as I said, overall, the rates of PTSD in the first days after trauma, moving on to the months after trauma, tend to drop. But it asks the question then, can we predict who's going to develop PTSD? And this has been a big question over 20, 30 years, because a lot of people have wanted to get in early after a trauma and stop PTSD from developing. Can we do that? But to do that, we need to be able to identify who it is that's going to get PTSD. Because if most people are having sort of an acute stress reaction, but most of these are going to just sort of abate with time, we don't want to intervene with all those people. We only want to intervene with those people who actually are going to have a longer-term problem. Let me tell you about some work that's tried to look at this by building on the extinction story. That is, looking at indicators reflecting extinction mechanisms, or conditioning rather mechanisms, to actually work out, can we predict who gets PTSD? Now, this is a bit of data from a very large study that was done here in Australia a number of years ago. Melbourne ran a large part of it, mainly people at the Phoenix Centre. And it recruited over 1,000 people across 3 states, and we recruited them in hospital, assessed them there, and then followed them up 3, 12, 24 and 6 months and 6 years later. And we assessed them for PTSD and other disorders. And one of the interesting things we found is that people who ended up getting PTSD had significantly higher resting heart rates in the first 48 hours after trauma than people who didn't. And this is actually a very robust study that's been found in numerous other sites as well. Now, resting heart rate is a very simple measure, but potentially it's a measure of sympathetic arousal and potentially of conditioning in that acute phase after trauma. Another interesting finding we found in that study was the role of morphine. Now, what's morphine got to do with PTSD? Morphine's interesting because it actually, apart from being an analgesic, it actually attenuates norepinephrine production. Now, the production of very strong trauma memories and fear conditioning in the aftermath of trauma implicates 2 of the key stress neurotransmitters. It's the noradrenergic system and the glucocorticoid system. Now, what's interesting about morphine is that it actually reduces norepinephrine, so it reduces the degree of stress hormones that are being released. We know that it reduces fear conditioning in rats in experimental studies, and so we were interested, can we actually look at does getting more morphine straight after a trauma reduce PTSD? And in fact, we found that it did. That is, the more morphine you got inside 48 hours, the less likely you were to have PTSD. Now, looking at the degree of morphine you got after 48 hours didn't make any difference. It was in that short window of time when we have an opportunity to limit how those memories are going to be consolidated. But to be honest, all our attempts at being able to predict who gets PTSD, and I've just given you a couple of examples there, there have been hundreds of studies done using all sorts of biological, cognitive, behavioural, emotional indicators to predict it. And are we actually accurate in being able to predict in the days after a trauma who's going to get PTSD? And the answer is no. We are not very good at it at all. Now, why is that? Now, this is going back to that injury study I just mentioned. And this is a study we did where we actually looked at the rates of PTSD over the first 2 years. And what was interesting is the prevalence of PTSD basically stayed the same over time. It didn't change. What was interesting is who those people were. And so basically at every assessment, only 50% of people sort of stayed at the same status that they had at the previous assessment. So we categorise people as having no PTSD, sort of subsyndromal or sort of middling PTSD or full-blown PTSD. And basically, as you can see, people just kept moving between having no PTSD to subsyndromal to full and back again, etc. And essentially why people kept changing their status over time is because of what was going on in their lives. It's the life stress that's going on. And often we assume that there's a linear relationship between how PTSD is happening at any one point of time. But this just highlights that it's actually a very dynamic and a very fluctuating disorder. And this has led people over the last few years to take a different approach to understanding the course of PTSD, because whenever in psychology or psychiatry we look at averages, we're screwed, because it always gives you a totally misleading understanding of what the clinical profile is. And so this is something called latent growth mixture modelling, and it's a form of statistical modelling that allows us to look at the different trajectories of stress reactions over time. And essentially this has been replicated in many studies, dozens of them. And most of them, we found 5 trajectories here, 5 groups of sort of types of trajectory, most find 4. But everybody finds that most people, about at least 75%, are resilient. That is, over time, they're doing fine. And to be honest, from a clinical point of view, these are the people we don't have to worry about. They're always going to be good. You've got a smaller group who are always distressed. You've got a group who tend to be not so distressed, but they get worse over time. And then you've got a group that's initially distressed and they then start to get better over time. Now, I think the take-home message from this is that it's naive to think that we can actually predict who's going to get PTSD in the first few days, because it's not a linear relationship. And just to highlight this even further, the disorder itself is not the same thing. This is a study we did using the same data, but using something called network analysis, where we looked at the relationships between the symptoms. And essentially, in the acute phase, the symptoms are not very well connected. It's a rather amorphous response of stress reactions. But then, when you look at them later on, at 12 months, it actually starts to become more into the syndrome that we know as PTSD. The symptoms are becoming interconnected. And it takes time for that syndrome to emerge over time. Let me move on to treatment. PTSD is a bit unique in that it's one of the few psychiatric disorders where its psychotherapy is the preferred treatment over pharmacotherapy. Every treatment guideline around the world will tell you that. And essentially, it's trauma-focused cognitive behaviour therapy is what's recommended. Now, essentially what this treatment does, it's not rocket science. It teaches people to reduce their arousal, and then it does 2 core things. It gets people to process their trauma memories. And it does this in a way to teach people that the memories are no longer distressing. And so in therapy, we would typically get people just to simply go over the memories of the trauma time and time again, often between 6 or 8 times. And then we would also teach people to really challenge and test against reality the appraisals they're making about the trauma, about themselves, and about the likelihood of future harm. Now, this is without doubt the best treatment we've got, but what I want to highlight is that if we're totally honest and we look at the recent meta-analyses, about 50% of people are responding to this treatment like we want them to. So it's not great. But if we're honest, that's what where we're at the moment in how effective we are in treating PTSD. Now, the thing to understand about our trauma-focused CBT is that it is essentially a human analogue of extinction learning, because essentially what we're doing is we are teaching people new learning that all the reminders of their trauma are no longer threatening. And there's been a lot of work that tells us that the same neural circuits that are involved in extinction learning are involved in cognitive behaviour therapy. But as I say, it only works for half of the people. So is there any way that we can use neuroscience to try to identify who it is and who it is not working for? And I just want to share with you a little bit of data that we've just been looking at recently in our lab, in a study where we looked at 40 people with PTSD. So it's not a massive sample, but it's not bad. And we assessed them on some fMRI, some functional brain scanning tasks, prior to receiving a course of 10 sessions of trauma-focused CBT. Now, one of the tasks we got people to do is what we call a reappraisal task. This is very common in psychology. And essentially, reappraisal is a keystone element of CBT, because essentially what we're asking people to do is to reinterpret their experiences, reinterpret their memories, reinterpret their appraisals, and in a more realistic way. And so one of the questions is a person who's able to do that more effectively, and we can indicate that with neural markers, is that likely to predict treatment outcome? Now, the standard reappraisal task that one does in a brain scan environment is something like this, where you would actually, you'd be lying in a scanner, and then through the goggles you would actually get an instruction to actually think or reappraise what's about to follow, or to just watch it. And then you are shown an image, which might be a traumatic image, or it might be a neutral image. And then you can just rate how distressing it is. Now, when we did this task, and then we followed up people later and see how well they fared with their PTSD, what we found was that during reappraisal, reduced amygdala reactions during reappraisal predicted how well people did in therapy. Interestingly, during the watch trials, that is, they weren't reappraising on these, they were simply just told to lie there and just take it in. It was actually increased amygdala and hippocampus activity that actually predicted treatment response. Sorry, I think I misspoke on the previous one. I think that should have been... Oh no, that was the insula. Amygdala, yes. Now, what's interesting about that is that what it's saying is that what CBT is essentially meaning to do is we want people to be able to engage their trauma memory. We want them to be able to engage their emotion, because if you can't do that, you can't process what you've been through. But when you're asking to reappraise it, we do need you to be able to down-regulate it. And what this study tends to be doing, I think it's telling us that patients who can downplay their amygdala during reappraisal, but they can actually engage it when they're not reappraising, these are the people who are likely to respond well to this sort of therapy. But one of the things that our lab's been looking at a lot in recent years is the different subtypes of PTSD, because one of the problems with a lot of our psychiatric disorders is that they're all basically defined by committees, and they are not really biologically founded, and they're not even sensibly founded or scientifically founded. And so often we try to look at how something like a biomarker can predict an outcome, but is it actually making sense? Now, interestingly, in PTSD, there's been a lot of work done, and if we actually tease out the symptoms, there are many symptoms that fall into what we would call fear symptoms, but many others that are actually more dysphoric or depressive symptoms. Now, these are interesting sort of distinctions, because biologically these map onto very different neural networks. Now, in this particular study here, we had the patients who went through treatment. We actually just gave them a task where they were simply watching faces, and the faces were emotionally valenced. They were either fearful or sad or neutral. And what we found was that we looked at how people responded in terms of reduction of their fear symptoms and response in terms of their reduction of depression symptoms, the dysphoric sort of PTSD symptoms. It did not predict reduction of dysphoria, but it did predict reduction of fear. And it was the insula that activation predicted it. Now, the insula is interesting because, again, it taps into affective processing and interoceptive awareness. And again, this is an important network for PTSD. And it just highlights that if we're really going to try to move towards more precise approaches in a sense of precision psychiatry, we need to be getting away from just this overall sense of what PTSD and look more in a refined way about what are the particular symptoms that we actually are predicting are being targeted. And just finally, I thought I'd share with you, in terms of the neuroscience findings, just something I was looking at yesterday, and we haven't really processed this yet. But the brain is not just simply a single network. Obviously, it's a very complex interaction of many, many networks. And so it makes a lot more sense to actually look at this. So we've recently just done a study where we looked using a connectome approach, and this actually more reflects the entire activity of the brain. And to cut a long story short, what we found here is that the intrinsic network connectivity was negatively associated with treatment outcome. That is, the less connectivity I had between some of the key networks in the brain, and particularly those networks involving the central executive or attention networks, the salience networks, and those default networks that are involved with autobiographical memories, which are all pivotal to PTSD. These are critical because these all speak to functions about threat detection, about how I process my memories, about how I process my emotions. It's how these things are all interconnected, are strongly predicting how people are responding to treatment. Now, I'm not quite sure how to interpret these findings yet, but it just tells us that we need to take a much more sophisticated approach if we're going to understand that. But let me move away from the neuroscience because it's not all about the brain. And let me, oh, sorry, it is all about the brain for a moment. I forgot this overhead. I do want to highlight, though, that one of the challenges we do have in this field is that obviously patients who come into our clinics come in with a genetic profile. And this is not something that we can do much about, but we need to be aware of because we might need to target different treatments to their genetic profile. And there's a couple of older studies that we've done, for example, where we found that the short allele of the serotonin transporter was a significant predictor of treatment response. Now, this is important because this is linked to fear conditioning. We've also found that the metallele of the BDNF gene, and that's important because without getting into detail, this is a critical factor involved in extinction learning, which is pivotal to PTSD. Now, if you've got a particular genetic profile, that means that you've got greater release of that in your brain at the time of doing therapy, you're more likely to respond to therapy. So how people walk into the clinic with different neurotransmitters available to them, depending on their genetic profile, will impact on how they respond to treatment. But I wanted to make the point that PTSD is also influenced by social factors, and particularly disasters. And there's a lot of, most of the world, the traumas that people experience are actually large scale. Now, we've been looking at this recently, and again, this is with colleagues in University of Melbourne, and particularly population health. As you all know, and this audience doesn't need to be reminded about the 2009 Black Saturday event. Well, along with population health people here, we conducted the Beyond Bushfire study, which was a large epidemiological study that was done 4 years and then a second wave 6 years later. And we did the normal epi-cut studies. We asked about mental health, but we also critically took a social network approach. Now, what's social network? It's actually pretty new to mental health, to be honest, but it's quite big in other areas. And essentially what a social network analysis does, it tries to look at a whole group of people. It might be a class, it might be a club, it might be a town. Some people have gone much bigger and looked at the entire Facebook communities, with millions of people. And essentially what it does, it tries to look at the relationships between people and to see how characteristics of those people actually relate to each other. Now, what's this got to do with Black Saturday? Well, we took an interesting approach here where we didn't ask people just about their PTSD and depression, etc. We asked everybody to nominate at least 10 people that they knew who they were very close to. And then what we did, we did a social mapping exercise where we linked everybody with everybody else. And because the Black Saturday fires affected rather small towns, this was actually a very feasible event. Obviously, you couldn't do it in Melbourne, but in the towns that were affected, it could be done quite easily. And so in a normal network analysis, you'd end up with a whole bunch of people being connected, and some are connected and some aren't, etc. When we looked at the Beyond Bushfire study, this is essentially what we got. Some people were down the bottom, they're loners, they're not with anybody. Some people are connected with one or two people, and others are very, very tightly interconnected. To cut a long story short, what we found, you can ignore some of that. I want to get down to the bottom, just at the PTSD results. What we found is that you are more likely to get PTSD at wave 1 if you were part of a social network, but that social network, the people in that social network did not know each other. That is, if you actually were part of a social network, you knew people, and those people knew each other, the likelihood of you getting PTSD was less. And so it basically suggested that PTSD increased if your social network was fractured. But social network analyses like these are pretty limited cross-sectionally. So fortunately, we went back a second time and we've got longitudinal data. And what that is starting to tell us now is very interesting. It appears that in the case of depression, what's happening is the depression, people who are more depressed are seeking out other depressed people. That is, depressed people are linking with depressed people because they tend to be selecting them more. In PTSD, it's a very interesting finding because what we're seeing longitudinally is there seems to be a contagion effect. Now, we don't tend to think about PTSD as being something that could be contagious. But what we're seeing here is that if you have PTSD, then the people who know you, who you're close to, are more likely to become depressed. And given the symptoms of PTSD and how that can, the impact it can have on other people who are interacting and living with people with PTSD, that can make sense. But this is a very interesting paradigm because it takes us beyond the individual and it highlights why at a social or community level that PTSD can actually have quite significant effects. And this has got implications in terms of policy making, etc., particularly in the context of disasters. And the last topic I want to talk about in terms of treatment is something that I've been working on the last few years, which is when we talk about PTSD, how do we actually go about treating it for most of the world? We know that if you're in a conflict or war-affected country, you're far more likely to have PTSD and other mental disorders. The World Bank estimates that in another 10 years, nearly 50% of the world is going to be in a fragile or conflict-affected country. So we're talking huge numbers of people. And so it's an outstanding issue about how do you actually deliver evidence-based interventions to people in those settings. We've got the highest number of people since World War II who are currently displaced. We've got 70 million of them. 25 million are refugees. And there have been estimates that we've got over 125 million of these people who are needing mental health care. And what's interesting is recent studies that have come out are estimating that over 90% who need mental health care don't get it. And when we're talking about the phenomenal absolute numbers here, it's mind-boggling. So this is one of the recent, my current labs, if you like. This is where I'm doing a study. This is a refugee camp on the Syrian border. So the question arises, how do you actually treat PTSD in a camp that's got 140,000 of people, and there's no psychologists or psychiatrists, and in fact hardly any health infrastructure? Evidence-based treatments do work in environments like that, but the fact is they're not workable, because the problem is, with most of the evidence-based treatments we've got, they tend to be very disorder-specific. That is, you've got a manual for PTSD, a manual for depression, another one for social phobia, another one for this, another one for that. And that means people who actually provide this stuff have to learn all those things. And that's a problem, because that's very time-consuming. Most of the interventions that we currently have are very long. They often go for 10 or 15 sessions, is what's prescribed. And that's actually problematic too in a poor country, because a health system that's got no dollars to actually pay for cancer treatment, let alone mental health treatment, how are they going to afford to pay anybody to provide that many sessions? Apart from the fact that most people in poor countries, they cannot go to the sessions that often. Because if they've got a choice between going to a mental health session or going off to the fields and getting a bit of work to feed their kids that day, it's a no-brainer what they're going to pick. And the biggest obstacle is that most of these interventions rely on qualified practitioners. And in most of these countries, they just don't exist. So, this has had a big push in the last number of years towards what we call scalable interventions. Now, a scalable intervention is one that can be ramped up in a low and middle income country pretty quickly. It's really summarised there in blue on the right-hand side. These really have to be trained to lay providers briefly. You typically got to take a transdiagnostic approach, so you basically you boil it down to one treatment that you think is going to sort of have the best bang for your buck in treating most of the stress-related problems. That way you do away with any diagnostic assessments, that reduces training requirements, and it's got to be few sessions. So this led us a number of years ago to work with the WHO. And with the WHO, we've developed a number of brief interventions that basically have aimed at coming up with an evidence-based approach that does actually help people's mental health in these sort of countries, but can be easily trained and delivered by lay providers. The first one we've worked out a few. The first one has been something called Problem Management Plus, which is just 5 sessions, and it trains people in just simply how to reduce their arousal, how to do basic problem solving, behavioural activation, which is basically just getting up and being active, and accessing social support. None of this is rocket science, but if you look at the meta-analyses, these steps are actually quite effective in reducing anxiety and depression. Now, basically, we've done a bunch of trials via RCTs that have been published. And the good thing about these is that we got an agreement with the WHO where they agreed that they would not disseminate any of the programs that we develop until they were actually proven in 2 independent trials. So we had to get 2 independent trials before these are being disseminated. So the PM Plus has now achieved that. So this is just an example of one study we did. It was in Peshawar in Pakistan. This is a pretty rough neighbourhood. It's the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan. It's the home of the Taliban, so a lot of civil conflict. And essentially what we did was we trained lay providers in this PM Plus, and we randomised about 170 to PM Plus or to just treatment as usual. And to cut a long story short, that's the PTSD result, where we could find that 3 months after the intervention that we were able to significantly reduce the PTSD. and these people only received 8 days training. Now, there's a lot of people still with PTSD in this sample, and so it's not the panacea, it's not the be-all and end-all, but it is something that at least is chipping away and into that sort of domain. So I'm going to wind up now and allow some time for questions, but let me finish by just saying I do think we have a long way to go when it comes to understanding PTSD. We've got a long way to go in terms of treating it. I think the points that I'd make today is that we do need to have a far more nuanced approach to how we understand the disorder. I think the very simplistic notion that we have is driven by committee, and that really isn't based on science. If we're going to move more to a more precision psychiatry approach, we do need to have that more understanding better about what the phenotype of stress reactions are, rather than just being hung up by a diagnosis. And really, if we're going to develop treatments that can be disseminated to large numbers of people, we've really got to understand what the core phenotypes are and what the mechanisms underpinning those phenotypes, those subtypes, if you like, of PTSD, if we're going to get the best return for treating PTSD.
I want to thank Richard for a really erudite tour of what is a vast literature. You've got the latest expert info now that you can take forward, and yeah, please join me again.